So welcome everybody. Good morning if you're on the East Coast of the United States and early birds on the West Coast and friends in Europe and elsewhere. I'm Jeff Getman with American Purpose. This conversation this morning is part of a 3-day virtual conference. We're on day 2, a 3-day virtual conference marking 1 year American Purpose. My colleague Michelle High will put into chat a link. So if you haven't seen the entire program, please take a look. Feel free to join. We have more today and more tomorrow. This morning, this is a gem. This is really a jewel. I look forward to all of it, but I've been excited about this, if I may say, in particular, a conversation managed or led by Richard Aldous with Thomas Chatterton Williams. Richard will give a proper introduction, lead the conversation. It's 50 minutes, 50 sharp. Richard is the distinguished historian and biographer at Bard College. He is also, lucky us, host of Bookstack, American Purpose's weekly podcast, Books and Authors. Richard is always working on a book. He's working on a new one, a biography of Douglas Dillon, the Treasury Secretary who served, if I'm correct, Richard, from around 1961 to 65. That's an interesting piece of American contemporary history. I think he was also, for a period, U.S. Ambassador to France. And Thomas Chatterton Williams is joining us today from Paris. Gentlemen, looking forward. It's your show. Richard, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Jeff, and thanks for that kind introduction too. And good morning, everyone. First of all, can I say what a great pleasure it's been to be involved with American Purpose over the past year. I think everyone can see from events like this one today and from the other events in the anniversary conference just how ambitious this new project is. So congratulations to Jeff, to Michelle, and to Frank for a really great first year. Before we start, just to say that there will be time for questions, so do make yourself known in the chat if you'd like me to call on you. But now I'm so pleased to welcome our guest today. Thomas Chatterton Williams is the author of Losing My Cool and Self-Portrait in Black and White. He's a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, columnist at Harper's, and a visiting fellow at AEI. And he is, of course, one of the most interesting and imaginative cultural commentators working in the United States today. Thomas, thanks so much for joining us.
A pleasure. Thanks so much for waking up early to join me here.
Yes, it's definitely a more civilized time in Paris. I was struck with Self-Portrait in Black and White, that you begin that book with a quote from Ellison, that blood and skin do not think. I wonder, what is it that appealed to you about that idea, and why did you start the book with that?
Oh, thanks. That's the first time anybody has ever, maybe the first time anybody has ever asked me a question about the epigraphs I've chosen in anything. And, you know, you put so much thought into choosing those phrases that it's really nice that somebody reads them and asks. That was actually, at first, that I was toying with the idea when I was still writing the book of titling the book Blood and Skin, actually. And I think my agent at the time said it sounds like too close to a horror novel or something like that. So you could throw off the potential book reader. But I really was attracted to this kind of idea that Ellison had in that comment, which I think gets short shrift today, which is that who we are is not determined by the melanin content in our epidermis or by the so-called drops of black or white blood that we possess in some other greater body of blood flowing through us. The idea that there is blood that can be separated that way is a disastrous idea that's led to so much harm, and an idea that I used to really buy into. And that kind of life experience and the paradoxes of having both in my own life and then in my life as a parent, observing my children, seeing that these boundaries, these markers don't mean much, don't mean anything scientifically. That somehow felt to me very much conveyed in a fresh way in this Ellison quote. Yeah, and I sometimes still wonder if that maybe expresses the idea of what I was getting at even a little bit better.
I mean, it's interesting that you talk about what you used to think as well, because one of the things that you've written about a lot is how you've been on a journey really in thinking about these issues, that you talk about how earlier you'd written that you and your children would always be described as, or what you describe as, unassailably black. And now you say that that makes you wince. So why so? Maybe tell us about the journey, but also why does that make you wince now?
Sure. Well, you know, I'm 40 years old. I was born in 1981, the son of a black man who is really old enough to be my grandfather. My father was born in Longview, Texas, then grew up in Galveston, Texas in the late 1930s and early 1940s. So really well ahead of any conception of civil rights. He grew up under segregation. And he's a sociologist by training. And so I grew up in a household that was very clear about the fact that race is a social construct and is not biologically meaningful, but that it's socially very meaningful, and that the custom in America is that a drop of black blood makes you black. My white mother, sociologist by training too, also agreed with that. And I think my parents were really trying to do my older brother and me a service by preparing us for how they expected the world to see us. And so that we wouldn't fall into confusion or kind of run away from social dynamics that would grip us. And I think this really served me well in the 80s and 90s. I didn't really have a conception of mixed race identity. I found myself really spoken to when Barack Obama explained why he checked the black box on the census and not multiple boxes. That was very much the way I grew up. And I didn't find any resistance from the world that I grew up in with this conception of myself. The mostly what my parents would call ethnic white neighbors that I grew up around, Italians, Polish, Irish, whites, scarcely any Jews or WASPs. They didn't think I was white, and the black kids I grew up around and the Latinos that I grew up around simply accepted a wide variety of physical appearances under the black umbrella. So it was a frictionless kind of self-conception. And then as I got older, I felt it was politically meaningful to kind of express a certain solidarity by really reifying the abstraction of race. I thought it could undermine the interests of people who could be considered less fortunate than me. I thought that having everybody in this fight together would be the right thing to do. It was only later when I found myself 29 years old, 30 years old, moving to Europe, living in Europe, attempting to explain the logic of hypodescent, the plantation logic of white purity, essentially, that I was reinforcing, that I was supporting, to people that, you know, weren't necessarily opposed to it, but didn't also necessarily grow up with that way of thinking and didn't just assume it was correct. That was the first crack in my sense of this stuff being meaningful or potentially even helpful. And then it was the birth of my daughter in 2013, who the way that she looks, I can tell that she's mixed, but very few other people can, not related to her. Blonde hair, blue eyes, light skin. I just started to wonder what it would mean to send her into the world with a binary understanding of herself as either or, therefore 100% black. And it wasn't that I thought, oh, here I have this white child because she's got blonde hair and that makes you white. It was that I thought that these categories are meaningless. The legitimacy of these categories fell apart for me. And it wasn't something that I could will myself into believing anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you talk about the European side. We'll come on to talking about the family side in a second. But there's a great story in the book where you talk about being at Wannsee in Berlin, where the final solution was planned by the Nazis, and you describe how it's a chilling example of what happens if we try to categorize and codify on grounds of race. And you point out that the Nazis, in fact, were using examples from the American South to draw up the rules, including for marriage, in a way they were channeling Southern slavers. And that's something that you want to walk away from.
Yeah, that was a really, really powerful experience for me. I mean, that was 2017. I was at the American Academy in Berlin, and I went with my best friend, who's also my daughter's godfather, Josh Yaffa, who writes from Moscow for the New Yorker. We went to the house of the Wannsee Conference Museum. And I just stood in front of this large diagram, or this large reproduction of the Nuremberg laws with the circles of identity, the different degrees to which one could be Jewish. And any degree to which you're Jewish, you're essentially 100% Jewish. And, you know, I was thinking about having read Hitler taking his inspiration from Southern laws of hypodescent in the US. And it was one of those moments where I questioned, what am I doing upholding this way of thinking and not actually trying to subvert it? And then I decided that it's a very difficult battle. It's not a battle I necessarily think I can win every day. But it's a little act of personal resistance to refuse to play what my late friend Stanley Crouch called the all-American skin game. I just won't participate in filling in the circle to the extent to which my daughter is a quadroon, or whatever the terminology would officially be for her. And in the book, I try to make the point that, you know, my children, you know, like many people's children, like many parents have observed with their children, my children they had to learn to think about race. They had to learn to think certain physical characteristics were more meaningful than others. And I wanted to kind of make an argument for a more naive way of thinking about physical difference, one that could return us to that kind of innocence, because I think the Nuremberg laws are a very sophisticated way of thinking about race, ancestry, heritage, physical difference. And I think that overly sophisticated ways of thinking about these things has led to an extraordinary amount of suffering and harm.
Yeah, it's very striking, that phrase that you just used there, where you write in the book, "I will not enter into the all-American skin game. I'm resolved to take a risk and walk away." But as you've pointed out yourself, the response that some of your critics have made to that is, well, you know, wait until you have a run-in with the police, then we'll see how black you are. What do you think of that dialogue, and how do you respond to it?
I think that dialogue is rooted in historical realities, historical experience that I think are less true. I think it's less meaningful to talk about Black people or white people and Latino people and Asian people, for that matter, as a monolithic category that experience the same social realities. So, for example, I tend to think that gives short shrift to the importance that class and education play. I don't actually don't think that I will have that type of wake-up call interacting with law enforcement. But even if I were to, that shouldn't actually define the way that I conceive of myself. I don't think that the biases and the prejudices that a law enforcement officer who might profile me and might even attempt to violate me, I don't think that what he believes to be true in this world should negate the kind of achieved perspective that I've realized after a lot of thought and reflection. I don't think that a bouncer, I put this in the book, you know, getting turned away from a nightclub in Munich, it was a clearly racist rejection. I don't think that that should actually determine the way that I continue to think about myself and define myself. And in fact, I want to do what little I can to define myself in a way that makes sure that I don't actually buy into the same exact premises that that racist also believes are the way the world is structured. So I just don't find that a very persuasive argument, but I do understand the pain that it comes from. It's something that my dad could have said. I think that his thinking has evolved a little bit on this too, because I think he understands that there are multiple so-called Black realities, more so in the 2020s than in the 1930s.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, you talk about class. I mean, do you think that the link between race and poverty, the kind of the harsh realities that can involve, that's actually more sharply drawn for those who are underprivileged?
Oh, very much so. There's a real oppression that exists at the intersection of Blackness and poverty. And I would say of also of darker skin pigmentation and poverty. That's undeniable. What gets lost in the argument, though, and what I think has actually harmed in some ways the cause for genuine social justice, is privileged Ivy League educated media elites saying that they're unsafe in certain ways, that George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, for example, were actually physically unsafe. George Floyd was killed in a way that I think was conditioned by his racial makeup, but I think that it was very much conditioned by the fact that he was an out of work, essentially impoverished man. That doesn't get nearly talked about enough. The idea that he and I face the same risk, or he and somebody who has a platform in a major magazine, as many writers had claimed at the time, that the idea that they face the same risk, I don't just think that it's glib. I sometimes, I'm willing to accept that many people feel this to be true, but it minimizes what actually was really what George Floyd was really up against in this world. I mean, the encounter with the police was initiated by the fact that he was in a situation where he had to forge a $20 banknote to make a commercial transaction. That's just not something that happens to all Black people. And so I think this is something that Adolph Reed said very, very persuasively. We are actually not solving the racial problem by conflating the racial problem with problems of class, by making it all one and the same. And of course, I'm sorry, just to extend that a little bit, you do have, and no one wants to talk about it, but you have the instance of Tony Timpa or someone like that just several years earlier, being killed by police in much the same way, cops laughing while they're kneeling on his chest and he's saying he can't breathe, and he dies. And it just wasn't a story that mattered very much. He wasn't a powerful white man. He was also a poor white man. The police in this country, or not in the country I'm in, but in America, the police tend to kill about 1,000 people a year, and they tend to have, the thing they have in common is that they tend to be poor. Very few, I can't think of a Harvard graduate of any race who has met a similar fate.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, again, that you bring up this kind of idea of the link with poverty and the link with class. And I noticed in one of the recent articles that you did on Thomas Sowell that you pointed out that this is actually not a new issue, that he was writing kind of back around in the 1980s about how often elites would represent views as those of the disadvantaged, of the poor, which actually opinion polls showed were completely not what those people thought, yet they were represented in that kind of way. I think you gave the example of the LA riots, for example.
That's right. I mean, this was something that I think could have been a conversation, a really meaningful conversation, but we didn't really have it, not in the mainstream. Black people have always had, and there's Jill Leovy wrote a book in 2015 or so called Ghetto Side, which really looked at South Central Los Angeles and the kind of problems with police that these impoverished Black communities have. And her conclusion, which I think is very persuasive, was that Black communities tend to be both over-policed and under-policed. The contact they have with law enforcement is of a low quality and is oftentimes stop and frisk in nature, but actually there's a tremendous amount of victimization that goes unsolved. There's a tremendous amount of violence that is not followed up on. And these communities, even though their experience with the police is so unsatisfactory, oftentimes when they're polled, are begging for more police presence, for more policing, for more safety in their streets. And so to have a kind of elite Black media class, an activist class co-opt the idea of unsafety in police interactions as something that is a biological and ancestral issue, a racial issue. It's worse than just mistaken in a way. I've really been bothered by this. When Ibram Kendi or somebody like that says that, a policy or an idea that isn't anti-racist is necessarily racist. That's just not true, because you can't tell me that defunding, that a question like defunding the police is straightforwardly answerable of whether or not it's in the interest of a group, when that group is also suffering from violence, when there are two kind of problematic outcomes that one can perceive as happening from a single act or a single non-action. So I've rambled on and on with that answer, but essentially I think that it's not new. There's always been a discrepancy between what the man on the street and what the spokesman for the group says. People seem to be consistently surprised. We haven't learned that a lot of African Americans and Latinos are considerably more moderate or even conservative than white progressives in the Democratic coalition. And I think it's not just insensitive, but it actually harms our ability to do politics as liberals and people who want to actually figure out how to make this coalition work. It harms our ability to do that.
Yeah, and I suppose we saw that in the Democratic, choosing of the Democratic candidate at the last election, where Jim Clyburn made an intervention that completely changed the nomination process on behalf of Joe Biden in a way that genuinely seemed to take the media and a lot of activists by surprise.
Totally took them by surprise. And then you had the same thing happen again in the New York mayoral primary, where suddenly everybody was astonished that Black and Latino voters in the outer boroughs wanted a former police officer who was talking about law and order and the rule of law and things like this. It seems that we consistently don't learn this lesson. There have been super interesting surveys that show that white progressives are so far to the left of Black, Latino, and Asian voters that they are the only group with a negative view on white people as a demographic. White progressives view white people negatively. Blacks and Latinos and Asians don't actually, and no other group views themselves negatively the way white progressives do. This is a disconnect, and it's also tied into what voices, what perspectives from these so-called minority groups, white progressives choose to elevate, choose to say are speaking for from diverse perspectives. So it gets all tangled up with a dynamic that I think, it comes back to what we started the conversation on. This is racecraft. This is what happens when you think that blood and skin think, when you think that the color of your epidermis conditions your political perspective or your ideas about how much safety you want to ensure is maintained in your neighborhood.
I'm just going to remind everyone in the audience that we're going to be turning to questions very soon. So if you'd just like to let me know via the chat function, if you'd like to ask Thomas a question, and we'll come on to that shortly. I was also struck in that piece that you wrote on Thomas Sowell, that how important you see family, that he had pointed out that what he described as the anointed, but which you point out is probably what today we would call the woke, seem to be set on a collision course with the family. I wonder if that's one of the reasons why you decided to use the experience of family, of having children, as a way to frame your ideas about identity in the memoir. It's not just anecdotal. It probably doesn't feel like it when you're putting the trash out or doing the washing up, but it's also, this idea about family is also philosophical for you.
It is philosophical. That's a good way of putting it. And, I haven't quite thought of, I came to Soul quite late. I just was asked to review a documentary that was just made on his life's work. And so I read a bunch of his books at one time, and I defined myself as a liberal, and I went into it quite skeptical of the position that he occupies. And I found just constant reasonable assertions being made. And one of the assertions he makes that, I find very difficult to disagree with, and certainly that my father always told me, was that the most important unit and the most important political unit is even the family, and that you exert control and agency over what your values are, what you teach, what you pass on, what you choose to uphold, and that no one can be responsible for your education because the family takes control over the education. I went to terrible schools, totally mediocre schools, but my father never led me to believe that the beginning and end of my education happens in the time that I spend in those school buildings. I came home and I had another school, and he didn't have surplus money. He had intention, will, and time to do this. And so I've always thought that the responsibility we have to ourselves and each other within families must matter a lot more than it seems to matter in the mainstream debate now, where we look to institutions in the state for everything, and any failure there is determinative of what our outcomes can be, in a way that it really kind of, I think, goes against not just my father, Thomas Sowell's views, but what I think of as a genuinely Black tradition that goes back to Frederick Douglass, that goes back to a lot of, I would say Ralph Ellison, exemplifies this mentality, that being Black is a kind of discipline, and that no one ever told you that, the state would provide for you, or things would be delivered for you, but that you would, through wit and perseverance and resilience and grit and cleverness, you would make it happen yourself, or you would have the dignity of failing while trying. So that really resonated with me in a way that didn't strike me as conservative, but just struck me as actually a kind of common sense that we're leaving behind.
I mean, it's interesting being a kind of a self-identified conservative, that you've written a lot about cancel culture.
Me?
Yes.
Oh, I'm not self-identified conservative.
I thought that's what you just said.
No, I said I define myself as a liberal.
So I'm interested, when you use the word liberal, are you talking about classical liberalism? Are you, if you
I think these terms are
liberal,
becoming,
whether...
these terms are becoming difficult, because maybe what I think of as being a liberal is conserving something that's fast on its way out on the left, which is, I'm interested in really serious commitment to freedom of expression. I'm interested in, the right of individuals to resist group dynamics. I want universities to be maximally open to diverse viewpoints. I don't want to be treated on the basis of group identity. These are things that these are things that I would think were recently just straightforwardly liberal, but are certainly now more complicated. And even the term classical liberal now means different things when different people say it.
Yeah, it's interesting, because these clearly are things that have mattered to you. There was an op-ed in the New York Times that you wrote with other writers across a diversity of viewpoints. There was the now famous Harpers Letter, which again represented a diversity of viewpoints in defense of free speech. So it kind of seems to me, whatever label you may or may not put on yourself, the one thing that you are very clear about is that pluralism of ideas really matters to you.
Very much so. I'll put it this way. I vote Democrat, and I want a plurality of perspectives represented in public and private debate. And I think that includes seeing what conservatives bring to the table too. I really have an aversion to the idea that that certain ideas should not be platformed, or that the way to defeat bad thought is by banishing it from the public realm, and not by defeating it with superior thought. I mean, I really believe that very much.
So we've got some questions coming in. First of all, Frank Di Stefano. Frank, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask Thomas a question.
Sure, thanks a lot. Hey, Thomas. So I'm a real fan of your presence on Twitter, and I know you often—
I'm gonna tell my wife that, thank you.
Yeah, well, you often get drawn into these disputes about, free speech and cancel culture or whatever we're calling it. So I'm curious about what do you think is going on? Do you think there is truly a decline in Enlightenment liberal values across the West? Is this a blip, or is this something that is going to right itself, or is this something that's going to be with us for a while? And what do we do about it?
Thanks, great question. And I just joke, I'm going to tell my wife that there are at least some people that appreciate me on Twitter because she's been
fans on Twitter.
Me to
Some
get
people
off.
like to yell at you, but
this is a generational thing, I think. And I think it's something that's really conditioned by the technological capacities of social media, of constant mediation with screens, and of just the ability for so many people to both perform their political views and to simultaneously critique each other's political views, so that everybody is kind of always both playing offense and defense while trying to bring politics into almost every facet of at least their public lives. I think that's a huge part of it. So I think cancel culture is very real. It's not just, today there was an op-ed by Michelle Goldberg, who I really like, who was a teacher of mine at NYU, who signed the Harpers Letter, but she essentially said, she cited some statistic that there have only been like 446 people in academia who have been affected by cancel culture. And that just, man, that gets it really wrong, because it's not just about the documented cases, about all this stuff that you can't document, the climate that's created, the things that people don't say, the whisper campaigns that happen. And this is so real, and this is happening. I think it's really, 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 it's something that it's so difficult to solve, or even to grasp, to get your head around, because the extremes feed off of each other. So there's a serious and potentially more serious illiberalism on the right, absolutely. The kind of illiberalism that comes with these, for example, these anti-critical race theory bans that are disastrous, that a few other writers and I, said we want to be on the record opposing. That's not what we mean by opposing cancel culture. That's a problem. But then you also have this lack of belief in or respect for liberalism that's coming from the left. This idea that liberalism itself is a kind of way of safeguarding white supremacy, and that these are values that we actually have to jettison or transcend if we're going to actually achieve a better, more democratic society. I think that's really short-sighted, and it's potentially disastrous.
So you think it's about the technology less than the ideas, that the technology is driving the ideas, or do you think that something has happened in the culture that the ideas are losing sway? I mean, I guess I wasn't sure from what you said, is this a small minority that's using the technology to drive something in the culture, or something in the culture?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, it's hard to say definitively, but I would say that we have statistics that do show that 98% of all tweets or something are generated by an extraordinarily active and influential minority. So it is a minority setting the agenda. This is why you have the critical race theory or something that's been around for decades, just never gaining traction in the wider culture, and suddenly it explodes. So I think you do have like genuine minority views that that technology allows to be broadcast, and they become memes in the culture. I'm trying to figure this out for my next book. I don't have it figured out yet, but I think I guess George Packer called it, we're at a hinge moment. I think we're at a moment of a paradigm shift. We're at a moment where small ideas are able to gain traction in a way that depends on several factors having happened. I think in the past year, the spectacular case of George Floyd, the way that technology spread that image, that video, coupled with the profound insecurity that people were feeling because of a pandemic, coupled with, I don't think that this can be ever taken out of the equation, the kind of sinister specter of Donald Trump behind it all, and this idea that this campaign was the most important in the history of America, and democracy itself was potentially over if a certain outcome didn't happen. All of these things together heightened the kind of the salience of certain thoughts, and allowed for a kind of niche academic activism to gain a foothold. And I don't know if that would have happened if Hillary Clinton were president and there were no pandemic. I think that a lot of things happen to make possible, to prepare the soil for some of these things to grow. I'm not sure if that's a helpful answer still, though.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I'm not sure that we know actually the answer yet. I was just sort of curious at your take on it, whether you think it's going to go away. Is this just a moment, or is this a crisis of liberalism? For real?
My feeling is that we're genuinely in a kind of a generational debate over whether we want the kind of liberalism that we used to take for granted. I think that's very much up in the air. I think it's pretty clearly answered on the right that most people voting for the GOP are not interested in that. And you kind of have this kind of minority of conservatives who are interested in defending that kind of liberalism. And that's why for example, that's why I'm with Yuval Levin at AEI right now. I think that there's a real need for new thinking about alliances that cross over what used to be center left and center right, and make more significant the question of who is interested in liberal democracy and who is kind of extremist that's willing to embrace illiberalism, for example. But yeah, I think this is very much up in the air. I really do. I don't think it's just I don't think it's just a season that's about to change.
Thanks.
Okay, I have a question in the chat from RJ McGill. He writes, Thomas is sometimes attacked for being an Ayn Rand individualist in the face of group identity politics, and that this individualism itself is inherently a legacy of white privilege and capitalism. How does Thomas respond to this? Is there any legitimacy in the idea of individualism as a privilege and group identity as not privileged?
Yeah, well, I understand that there's this sense, and I think, I think some of these things have to be revised for the current very complicated multi-ethnic, multicultural democracies we now inhabit. But there was the sense that, my father grew up under segregation, so it really didn't matter if his neighbor was a Black janitor or a Black physician. They were, the group identity was imposed on them, and none of them could eat at certain restaurants or drink at certain water fountains. So I think that this is the kind of thinking and feeling that informs the idea that individualism is a privilege of white people who get to not be beholden to the group, who simply get to come to the group or leave it on their own terms. And white supremacy and racism doesn't allow that for non-whites. But I think that's just a lot less true now, first of all. And I also think it's a kind of racism to just accept that that non-whites must therefore kind of lessen their sense of individualism because this is how the chips have fallen and that's their lot. I think that there's small acts of resistance that we can all do every day to push back against the kind of constructs we're forced into. And I'm really not so naive as to say that I'm a complete individual existing outside of group dynamics, but I do, I think there's a long tradition of Black individualism, and I think that, Blacks are fundamentally Americans, and American culture is individualistic in many ways, and, it's something that resonates with many people who are not white, and so to simply dismiss it, it's too patronizing for me. So I'm willing to take that criticism. Yeah, the criticism doesn't bother me that much because I don't think it's necessarily pointing to something so true anymore.
Okay, Trent Morton has his hand raised. Trent.
Good morning, everyone. Thomas, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with everyone this morning. I think a few minutes ago you referenced, well, and I think Richard also referenced the Harpers Letter. I was just curious because I've kind of followed a lot of the fanfare that kind of went sprawling across the social media universe and just the commentary sphere after that. What was some of the most, I would say, compelling pushback that you received in response to that? And people, especially those who directly engaged you in a more liberal spirit, in a sense, to just discuss maybe a disagreement that might have that person might have had with your effort to put together that letter, and what stood out about that engagement?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think that the letter was so purposefully anodyne that I haven't seen any criticism on the substance that I can really take seriously. I mean, this was what Noam Chomsky said when people tried to say that they were so disappointed in him for signing it. He said, it's just a basic anodyne statement in defense of free expression. Like, you know, what's the counter argument to that? And some of the counter argument was that, well, we should think seriously about whether we endorse free expression depending on who else is endorsing it. I think that's a flimsy criticism that was really going around when people were very upset in the very first days of it by the fact that, like, J.K. Rowling, for example, had signed it. You know, the idea that we were making subliminal signals based on who signed it was something that really bothered me. So none of the criticism of what was in the text or was purported to be between the lines of the text really impressed me. I say that very seriously, and you know, there are criticisms of books that I've written that I do think land, but I don't think that this received compelling criticism. But I do think that there was an argument from some people on the right that was saying that it wasn't. We said it was an ideologically diverse spectrum of signatories. And so we would say someone like Frank Fukuyama, for example, signed from the right, and Noam Chomsky and Cornel West on the left. But there were people that argued that that was a constricted, that a lot of the right was left off. And I tried to take that very seriously, but I couldn't think of anybody coming from the extreme right. Some people said, why was there no pro-Trump supporter who signed? But I couldn't think of anybody who could check the box of real populist pro-Trump supporter and like diehard defender of freedom of expression, even if that's coming from, you know, even if that's defending the right of, you know, of people you profoundly disagree with to the left of you to speak. I just couldn't find the figures that we should have let on the list, or we should have sought out to sign the letter, who we didn't. So I don't know if this is a really dissatisfying answer, but I didn't find criticism to something that was so straightforwardly, I think, inarguably correct. I didn't see something that made me rethink it. Some people criticized the timing of the publication, but when is there a good time to reassert that, you know, we should not resort to mob justice to try to intimidate people into silence? I don't know when would be a better time.
No, I think that's, yeah, thank you so much for your answer. And I kind of agree. And I was just curious if you had heard anything more compelling, because that the argument was so straightforward and really axiomatic, I thought. So
yeah, and really that was on purpose. It was not super nuanced. It was a basic kind of defensive principle that a lot of people should be able to uphold without much second guessing.
So unfortunately, we've only got 4 minutes left. I can see Sean Keeley. Sean, could you maybe make your question really sharp?
Sure, I'll be quick. Thank you, Thomas. I just wanted to ask you about your experience as an American living and working in France, and how that might have shaped how you view the US, because France, of course, is a country with a great liberal tradition, but comes out differently in terms of, you know, religion in the public square, the way they deal with racial issues. So just curious if that made you rethink the US.
Absolutely, thank you. I can't remember when I first became aware of it, but probably around the time that I moved here in 2011, I was quickly struck by the fact that, for example, France doesn't keep racial statistics. It doesn't use the word race anymore in official documents. And the reason they don't keep racial statistics actually goes back to the Second World War. Jewish citizens were rounded up based on ethnic and census data that they decided that doesn't have any place in in a republic where everybody is equal, and they never want to have group identity imposed on individuals to such a disastrous end again. And there's a lot of criticism that comes from the US on this, that for example, it means that in the criminal justice system now, an unintended consequence of that is that it's difficult to know how many Blacks and Arabs are in prison, for example, and if there's significant bias in the criminal justice system, which I don't doubt that there must be. But I do think that, whether or not that kind of way of thinking about organizing your society is perfectly implemented today, or whether there's a lot of work to be done on the real racism that exists in society to make it worthy of this way of thinking about getting past, transcending ethnic and racial identity. I think it has to be the kind of endpoint we would want to get to. And then, living in France, it just seemed, what they call the Republican ideal. This seemed to me like straightforwardly where we should want to get to in the US. And I became more and more aware that actually a lot of people in the US, I don't think do want to get there. And so, I think on the left, you have people that are actually, I want to be careful how I say this, you have people that actually, even if they pay lip service to the idea that race isn't biologically real, they think it's so socially real that they, what Dr. King was arguing for, that's actually not what they're arguing for anymore. They really do want group and racial difference to be reified into meaningfulness. And so, yeah, so living in France, I don't know if I would have necessarily understood how that doesn't have to be the way that you think about these things. I don't know if I would have come to that conclusion if I would have started down this path to questioning the one-drop logic, even in my own family, had I not left kind of the water I was swimming in the US, where you don't even stop to think that there's another way of conceiving of it. I was having this conversation with a very fascinating woman, Adrienne Piper, artist and philosopher, who's pushed the boundaries of categorization her whole career, and who now lives in Berlin. And she was saying something similar. She was just saying that had she not moved to Berlin, it's not clear that she would have ever been able to step outside of the assumptions that keep this going in the US. But but it's my real belief that you don't have to actually leave the country to be able to change your view. I hope that through debate and through persuasion, that other people who never leave can begin to question some of these premises too.
Well, sadly, we're just about out of time. I think this session could have run and run and run. A quick reminder that Self-Portrait in Black and White is now out in paperback, published by Norton. And I have to say, it really is just such a beautiful and insightful book. I can recommend it to everyone who hasn't already read it. So on your behalf, I'd like to offer our thanks to Thomas Chatterton Williams for joining us today for such a wonderful conversation. Thomas, thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This was great.
And with that, I'll hand back to Jeff to give the formal thanks.
Well, my formal thanks is thanks, Richard and Thomas. What a treat that was. It seems to me that in this day and age, if you're not glib and you don't do posturing, you are officially part of the counterculture. And you two are part of the counterculture. It's such a pleasure. This may sound trite or schmaltzy, but it's such a pleasure to listen and learn and have a chance to reflect a little bit. And you've given us that today. So to everybody for your valuable time, Richard, beautifully done. Thomas, what a pleasure. Great to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.